Welcome to RenewCast, the podcast of Renew Education. I'm Noah Brink. Today we're talking about milestones. It's something that any adult who works with kids needs to think about and have a plan for, a strategy for, because kids need milestones, meaningful milestones. Consult the American Academy of Pediatricians and you will see throughout their website various pages about milestones by which we can chart the health, the developmental health of a child, where we say there are stages where we understand where a child should be at certain ages of their life. Look at different denominations that have looked at the religious life of a child, how a child goes through different stages, thinking about milestones. Milestones are important in the life of a child, and yet we live in a world where increasingly we are diminishing the value for milestones. Think throughout the history of the Bible. This idea of stones of remembrance, where the Israelites go across the Jordan River and Joshua sets up stones and Ebenezer, stones of remembrance, so that when people pass that Ebenezer, this pillar of stones set up, that someone could be able to say, this is a remembrance. That's why we set these up. It's a remembrance of what God has done. This idea of remembering is a big part of the Old Testament. And obviously the reason God keeps telling his people to remember is because of how quick, how prone they were to forget. And to be honest, we as God's people today don't struggle that much less with that. We need to be reminded, and milestones are a big part of that, but they're also a big part of the formation of a young person, of a child. So I grew up in a part of Memphis, Tennessee, where we lived within walking distance of an Orthodox synagogue. So as a result, many of our neighbors were Orthodox Jews. So we would play basketball in the driveway with my next-door neighbors. They would wear yarmulkes because that's part of their heritage. And because I grew up, many of my friends, so I went to a Christian school. My dad was a Christian school teacher, but a lot of my neighborhood friends were Jews, Orthodox Jews. And so since those are my neighborhood friends, often my brothers and I would be invited to bar mitzvahs. This idea of a 13-year-old Jewish boy coming of age, and they would start preparing for it. And the community would come alongside this boy and recognize that he is becoming a man. Now, we know in today's Western world that a 13-year-old is not a man. We know that, and people have talked about the idea that we've delayed adolescence, and a 13-year-old nowadays does not have the same responsibilities that a 13-year-old would hundreds of years ago. We've delayed many of the responsibilities in part because of the comfort and the pace of which our lives move. But growing up, we understood that there was something unique that our Jewish community understood. And by the way, there's a lot of history to that. And if you think about many other cultures, there were these stages where the community would come alongside, and not just for boys, so the Jewish version for the girls is called a bat mitzvah. But not just in Jewish cultures, other cultures would do similar things. This idea of a coming of age, of a journey or a path that a young person would go through as they head down this path towards adulthood. But it's not just about a path towards adulthood. It's part of a well thought out process by which we say we are walking alongside the formation of our children. And yet nowadays we have this obsession with wanting it all now, where kindergartners feel this need, or the parents often feel this need to make sure that their child, when they graduate from kindergarten, gets a special ceremony, even at sometimes with cap and gowns and even a little diploma, because it's cute. And then we feel like we need to do another graduation when the student graduates from elementary school, and then once again when the student graduates from middle school, and then when they graduate from high school. There's not much that's very different. We even see the same thing in terms of the way that students now feel this need to ask another person to prom or to homecoming. And in many ways, I find it amazing that some of the elaborate ways in which these boys are going about feeling, and there's pressure sometimes associated with it, to ask out a girl to a homecoming or to a prom, they're going through steps that 25, 30 years ago, people would have done in order to ask someone to marry him. That in many ways, there is this, we try to constantly push these things that much sooner. When I played JV basketball, I did not get the same quality of not only uniform for basketball, but even the warm-ups and the other things that went with it, because we weren't on the varsity team. And yet nowadays, you look at the sorts of uniforms that not only JV teams have, but middle school teams, and everything has to become that much more immediate. We expect to have that, and we get frustrated with this idea that you have to wait. And yet, our children need milestones. There's data out there talking about some of the aspects of what a child needs in order to have a lower anxiety, lower tendency towards depression, a healthier outlook at life. And one of the studies I read even talked about the importance of kids having homework, and you start to peel some of that back. And I think there's wonderful debates about the volume of homework, and I know that at some point in the future, we'll dedicate an entire RenewCast episode to homework. And yet, I believe that part of what homework does for a child is it gives a child a sense of completion, that they have these boundaries put around them. And we have an earlier episode talking about boundaries and bravery and delight. That children need milestones. They need to be able to have things to look forward to. But not only does it give them something to work toward, but also it gives them something to look back on, not only in our home life, but in our religious life. I do think that there's something to it where you have some of these denominations that tend to be a little more liturgical, that they would have these stages by which the child becomes a full member of the local body of Christ. You have different stages, and they're called different things in different churches, like confirmation. In my church, we didn't use anything like confirmation, but in my church, I was not allowed to be a member of the church until I went to this, they called it a pastor's class, where there was a recognition where I was 13. A group of us sat down with the pastor, and our pastor walked us through making sure that we understood the Westminster Shorter Catechism, that we had an understanding of some of these creedal and confessional parts of our faith, and that there was, you could say, a hoop that we had to jump through before we were able to come to the table. And yet, increasingly, you see people saying, well, those barriers, they push people away. And increasingly, I think that's where we are as a culture, that we look at barriers, we look at these markers, or you could say milestones, and we say that's actually pushing people away. You know, why would I go to one school that doesn't give the children a cap and gown graduation in kindergarten when this one does? That's more fun. That's more exciting. See how welcoming, see how affirming that school is. That's where I'm going to put my child. And I even think about that in terms of my time as a coach. Over my many years of coaching, I had some elite, national elite level athletes. One of my students, one of my athletes, her freshman year in college ran Division I track and won the national championship. And I had the pleasure of being able to coach her all the way through high school. And in my approach to coaching her, one year, I still remember her dad asking me, well, she ran certain times last year as a freshman at the state track meet, and we're a sophomore and we're a month of the way into the season, and she's not faster than she was last year. Do we have a problem on our hands? And I said to the dad, actually, I'm holding your daughter back. I'm intentionally trying to put milestones in front of her. I had a plan, a training plan for where I was hoping to take her. And we had agreed upon milestones of things that we were trying to accomplish. And I wasn't necessarily concerned about where we were early in the season, because my entire hope was to have her not plateau earlier in the season, but to peak right at the right time, and that I wanted to see her best times of the year be at the most important times, at the region and then state level track meets. And the father said, I never really thought of that. I just thought, well, if she was this way this year, we ought to just go ahead and see right away. We should see things better the next year. And yet there was this understanding of there's a process upon which I was building, and in some ways I was tearing his daughter down to build her back up. And that's a healthy part of development and of growth. And for us to be aware of that, milestones, if you imagine you're driving down the highway, a mile marker, it gives you an idea of how far you've come. It gives you an idea of how far there still is to go, but it grounds you. You know exactly where you are on that highway. If you're at mile marker 113, you know that this road, since the state line, has been 113 miles. And if you've got an idea with a map or whatever else, you may have an idea of how many more miles there are until your next exit or to the next state line. But it also grounds you to that place. And I think that's really important when we think about a child and the development of a child, where we put in front of a child different boundaries by which we would say, once we get here, then we will begin to celebrate that. And that's part of this other thing too, that you can celebrate properly where you are and recognize that for what it is. We don't have to give a child a trophy for every single thing they've done. I was an interim head of a school here in town for a couple years to help stabilize this school community. And we had a family that they couldn't understand, and we constantly had issues in the life of this school with this family and this child continuing to push against the teacher and push against the principal when the principal would try to provide a resource on some behavior management for this child. And when we began to peel back some of the layers, we understood part of what was happening, that every single day after school, the parents took the child to a local drugstore and allowed them to pick a gift every single day. That they had a situation where one day, I assume this would probably be early into this child's schooling. Now, this child was still in very formative years. This child was a kindergartner. But starting in his earliest years of his education, his formal school education, I guess his parents must have taken him to the local drugstore and let him pick out a toy or a piece of candy or whatever else. And the next day, the child asked for it again. And eventually it got to the point where the parents felt obligated to the child. And they would actually say they were scared of this little boy, that he had all of the power, that there was no sense of anything special, that every single day we buy you a present. We buy you one every single day. And I think, well, then what is a birthday like, or what is Christmas like? Because every day you're bestowing gifts. See, even birthdays are wonderful, wonderful milestones that we recognize how far that child has gone, and that's why has come, and that's why we celebrate that. In my home, my wife likes to mark out how tall they are and all these different things, and even she's interviewing our children on their birthday, where she asks them questions about what's their favorite book they've read, and she's recording all of these things. And it's a way to not only sort of chart how far they've come. My son right now is reading Lord of the Rings. He was not reading Lord of the Rings when he was in 1st or 2nd grade, but he's in 5th grade now, and he's reading Lord of the Rings because we can actually look at the sorts of things that he now has the capability of reading. It would not have been healthy for me to put a book like that in front of my son and to say, well, I know these are going to be some heavy words, but we'll figure this out. We'll walk through it together. Actually, I wasn't comfortable with him reading a book like that, or even for me to read it to him, because of the violence. And there were the orcs are scary. The ring wraiths are scary. Why would I want him to have that exposure? But it's important to be able to think through our plan. And once again, this whole conversation insinuates and it suggests that there's supposed to be a plan. In our schools and in our homes, we have to have a plan of how are we going to walk our child through a progression where they have things to look forward to, that then provides them a structure, that they have boundaries where they understand what they have to do in order to get whatever that carrot is or whatever that reward is. And that provides for them a sense of grounding. But also it gives us a proper avenue for celebration, and for celebration to be something unique. So my oldest daughter, one of the little mile markers, one of the milestones that we set for her was that she would be allowed to get her ears pierced at age 10. There's nothing magical about age 10. Nothing magical about it. But that was one of the ages we set for her. And we said, I know some of your friends got their ears pierced earlier. And that's, I think, once again, where parents and whoever else, we feel this pressure. Well, I don't want my child to be left out. And we want to, or as a school, we want to keep up with what the other schools are doing. And we're not thinking strategically with a plan. Sure, we could have had her get her ears pierced early, or we could have said at age 10, and then once we see all of our friends are doing it, we feel the pressure, we give in and we say it's going to be at 8th grade. Well, once again, there's nothing wrong about having her ears pierced at 8th grade. But in many ways, that grounded her. It gave her sort of a place that there's this something unique and special about her 10th birthday. And my youngest daughter understands that she's not old enough yet to get her ears pierced because she's not 10. Like I said, nothing magical about it. In our country, we have different milestones. For instance, legal driving age, legal drinking age, legal smoking age. And those are often linked to some data and some research in terms of when is a child becoming an adult where we trust a child with a several ton fast-moving vehicle. Would we trust a child at 13? I wouldn't. Well, is there something happening in the life of a child where at 16 we trust a child more? Well, yes. And similarly, I think that we need to think about all of the sorts of things that we put in front of our children, where it's healthy for them to see milestones, and we properly celebrate when we've reached those milestones. I love that kindergartners, many kindergarten schools, they celebrate the 100th day of school. That it grounds them. They understand, I've been at school for 100 days. And they have a party and they do different things to celebrate that. And even within our school classes, where you think like it's in 3rd grade where students start to be able to go on their first, maybe overnight field trip or whatever it is, that in our schools, and to see this gradual progression of increased responsibilities. My children go to Honey Rock Camp, where starting at their 3rd and 4th grade, they begin to have overnights where they go out with they're not in their cabin anymore, that their counselor takes them, they navigate off and do orienteering out into the wilderness, and they set up camp. And then once they get to entering 7th grade, they have a multiple night trip. And the older they get, but it's not just the length of the stays away from the camp proper, it's additional responsibilities, that there's an approach to looking at formation, spiritual formation, as a process, increased responsibility once you get to a certain age. These are the sorts of things we do. It should be true in our home. And in our culture, typically a lot of parents, we say, well, once you turn 16, you get your driver's license, and that's part of a rite of passage. But I tend to think that we need to be linking to those different milestones responsibilities. So in order to be able to partake of the Lord's Supper at our church, we had to take the pastor's class. There was things we had to do, and our pastor required for us to memorize parts of the catechism. Or in order to get your driver's license, for parents to say to their children, you have to be able to do certain things. You've probably listened to some of our podcast episodes and some of the things I've written, the blog posts that we have, where I talk about the dangers of technology and children, especially with technology. I encourage you, listen to the sort of things that Jonathan Haidt is saying. Read his book, The Anxious Generation. I read that and I thought, oh my goodness, I need to be increasingly vigilant with what I allow my child to have access to. I have a teenager at home, and she does have a phone. But her phone does not have an internet browser on it. It doesn't have YouTube. It doesn't have social media. Basically, she can use some apps that let her check her library account and check out books, for her to call, for her to text us, and I can approve who she has the access to receive or send text to. And she's asked me, she's like, is there something that I can do in order to demonstrate greater responsibilities to be able to be given additional things? And actually, I think that's a very healthy thing for her Now, I've read enough of the data, and sometimes it doesn't work in her favor from her thinking that her dad reads all of these different studies, but I do. And as a result, it probably is going to be quite a few years before I give her any access to social media, because I see that the data is suggesting we're not dealing with correlation, we're dealing with causation of the link between those things and depression and anxiety and mental health issues. But I think it's a healthy tool for us to say, yes, I'm going to begin to grant you greater responsibility. A rite of passage where you have some kind of marker to say, at this point, we're going to do something unique. So I mentioned in my upbringing, I had a lot of Jewish friends. They had bar mitzvahs. So my father, with all three of us, I'm the middle of three boys, we had our own little sort of Christian bar mitzvah where my father invited over not just our closest friends. So when I was turning 13, my father invited over my closest friends and their dads, and they did a responsive reading, a combination of different fathers and sons reading over me words of blessing from Scripture and prayers over us, where the son, one of my friends, would read a blessing from Scripture and maybe a challenge from Scripture, a word of caution from Scripture, and then the father would pray over me. And I just got to meet yesterday with a 14-year-old boy who's walking through sort of this rite of passage with his dad. They're reading books together, and his dad asked me if I would meet with him to have an additional man in his life in order to have someone to process these same things with. That helps, that it's not just his dad telling him these things, but other men are telling him these things. And I promised this dad, sure, I will do that, but just so you know, when my son gets old enough, you're going to be meeting with him. That to have a formal idea of where are we trying to move our children toward, where are we trying to move our students toward, what are the ways that we're allowing our children in our homes and in our schools to see increased responsibilities, to see what's expected of them in order to get those increased responsibilities, and they see that we celebrate with them when they've been then given those increased responsibilities. One of my earlier episodes, as I referenced, I talked about boundaries and bravery and delight. It's the exact same conversation here, that healthy parenting, healthy formation requires that we provide for our students, our children, clear boundaries, absolutely clear boundaries. It's healthy for them. But also that within those boundaries, we push them toward and we nurture bravery. We want them to take risk. We want them to have responsibility. We want them to be able to pursue boldly into the world, to step bravely into the world that they are entering into. Well, in many ways, a clear boundary allows that. But they're most likely to step bravely and boldly if they know what the boundaries are, and especially if they know that their father or their mother or their teacher delights in them. That we know them, we delight in the things they delight in, we know what gives them passion, we celebrate those things with them. And I think that's where we as parents and teachers and those that are creating school programs need to think deeply about what are these milestones that we're putting in front of our children strategically. Where do we want our students to be? See, I'm a big fan of understanding by design, this notion that you've got these essential questions that you're aiming toward. I think it's really important for us to think developmentally, not just as curriculum of content, lesson content, but the curriculum of the home, the curriculum of the school, where we're saying, where would we like to see our children be? As an 18-year-old, we believe that our children should be able to do certain things. Well, what are going to be the milestones that are going to help us along the way to get there? What are going to be the ways for us to evaluate as we hit that milestone, whether or not we reached that milestone before we move to the next? See, once again, one of the problems that I feel like with our modern way that we do education, we move on without mastery. That the reason a child moves from 5th grade to 6th grade math isn't because of mastery of 5th grade math, but simply because he or she made it through 5th grade without blowing it too significantly, got a year older, and because he got a year older in the mass-produced way we do education, that child now goes to 6th grade and is tackling 6th grade math, even if he didn't demonstrate significant mastery especially considering what little you have to do to pass in many of our school contexts. Well, obviously, we know the danger of that in terms of academics and in terms of learning, but think about that in terms of forming a person as a person. When we're forming a person as a person, we need to think of milestones, that these are checkpoints to see how are we doing. And if we can establish success there, now we can move on to the next one. Areas of responsibility within these boundaries where we're pushing them towards greater responsibility, where my daughter, my oldest, my teenager, is getting to the point where I believe that I can trust her babysitting. But in order to get to that milestone, we need to be able to entrust that she's been able to demonstrate responsibility in certain places, and then I grant her that responsibility. And then when granting that responsibility, I celebrate that along with her. And we need to think all the way down from kindergarten to first grade. What are going to be these different ways that we establish what these milestones are? Because that allows us, like I said, it allows us to chart where we've been. And whenever we're there, we need to be able to look back in remembrance and thankfulness. And what are the lessons we learned? So there's that wonderful reflection. It allows us to look forward because you know where you're going. And that gives you this sense of accomplishment. Here's a challenge. I'm extremely competitive. I like to know what's the goal. I don't like games, for instance, when I don't know how to win. If I'm going to play a game, I want to know, how do I win this game? It's healthy to give a child something to look forward to. My older brother is one of the most driven people I know. He once said to my dad that he wanted a bike. Well, my father was a teacher. We didn't have a lot of extra money lying around the house. And my father said, well, I'm willing to get you a bike, but what would you be willing to do? And they had these back and forth conversations. And my brother actually, of his own volition, said, I won't eat sweets for a whole year. And he didn't. As a 13-year-old, my older brother, and you think about most 13-year-olds, they're running towards sweets as fast as they can. My older brother didn't eat sweets for a whole year because he was trying to earn a bike. And once again, not eating sweets actually doesn't earn anything. Like, there's no monetary value assigned to that. But he was willing to work toward this thing. So once again, milestones, they not only chart where we've been, and so you can celebrate that and reflect and what did we learn, they give us what we're working toward, which is a wonderful thing as well, but they also properly ground us. We know where we are in the immediate because of those milestones. We know, and it's clearly understood, this boy that I was meeting with yesterday, he's got a pretty clear understanding of not only the books that he's reading with his father and the activities that they're working on together, but where this whole program is going. Our kids absolutely need milestones. We don't need to force everything at them at once. We actually need to think very strategically about what are the things that are best for a child. What should a child be able to do? And what are the things that a child should be exposed to? I'm shocked at increasingly that we just give children everything at young ages. And in some regards, that needs to drive some of the ways that my wife and I think about our own milestones with our kids. That we know that we needed to start talking about sexuality with our children much earlier than our parents did with us. But once again, that's not just a one-time conversation. There's other milestones along the way where we're having conversations with them about their bodies, but we're thinking very strategically about, so when are we going to have a very clearly understood conversation about sexuality? And what does that look like? And how do we celebrate that? And what are the responsibilities that come with that? I think it's really important for us to, and in the midst of all of those milestones, for there to be relationship. For our students, our children, to know that their teachers, their coaches, their parents are walking through those with them, that we're not just arbitrarily saying, go do this thing, and once you do this thing, here's your certificate. But they see that we are walking through this with them because, once again, our children need to know that the community is part of their formation. It's not just a singular relationship between them and their teacher or them and their parent. It's a relationship with a community. I can't wait until when my son is old enough for him to enter into this process of other men pouring into him intentionally and strategically as part of a sort of a coming of age. That's where generations before us went, of boys or girls sitting around the fire and listening to the stories of the tribe. And that's how they learned to become a man or a woman. And nowadays, our predominant milestones is just you happen to get a year older. So why does the child go to college? Simply because roughly he's 18 or she's 18. That's, when you think about, those are many ways kind of how we've built our program. Not because of mastery, but how much better would it be if we think, well, in order for our children to go to college, we need to accomplish these different things. That was the whole purpose of a high school diploma. You demonstrated success in a high school diploma. Now you've demonstrated the worth to be able to go to college. Now it's almost an expectation that anybody should be able to go to college. And anybody should be able to get a trophy even if your team didn't do very well. And anybody should be able to have access to a cell phone. And anybody should be given a driver's license. And anybody should, and just keep going through the list of all the things that we feel that we ought to have. I believe that milestones, they shatter a sense of entitlement. They properly ground us to the reality of where we are right now. And they further that notion that boundaries accomplish, that we recognize it's not about us. There is something higher than us. And that's one of the reasons that meaningful milestones are a powerful part of the developmental process for our kids in our homes and in our schools. And so my challenge to you is, if you're working with children in any capacity, in whatever community you're in, is to form a process of development that takes into account what are those milestones and what are we asking our children to do within those. What are the responsibilities we're giving middle school? What are the responsibilities? Not just increased level of complexity of lessons and curriculum, but what are the responsibilities you're giving them now that they've reached middle school? And how did you celebrate with them that they reached middle school? And once you get to 10th grade, what are some of the responsibilities they have there? But constantly thinking through what are going to be these milestones that we give to our kids, and how do those milestones, like I said, they help us to look back and reflect on that and to remember and to have gratitude. How do they give us something to work toward, but how do they ground us today? Removing the entitlement and helping us to recognize, here's where I am, and to then, because of that grounding, because of that boundary, to then have the bravery, because of the delight that's been expressed in us in that stage, in that immediate place that we're in. Meaningful milestones. Our kids need it. And even we, the adults that are in their lives, need those in our lives too. I need milestones as well. They're good for us. They remind us of, even there, how deeply we need Jesus, because those milestones, we often sometimes see that we didn't meet it. And they remind us of how deeply we need each other. They're good for us. They help us to lean on one another. And I think even there is another context for us helping to lean on our dependence on Jesus.
Thanks for listening to RenewCast. You can subscribe to our show at Apple, Spotify, or anywhere else you find your podcast episodes. Visit our website at www.renew-education.org to learn more, or follow us on our YouTube channel.